everyone. I am Dan Scarfe. I am Chief Solutions Officer for New Signature, which is the new Microsoft business group at Cognizant. The irony is not lost on me that we are a Canadian IT security event and you are being spoken to by two Brits. I'm recently moved here to Canada because the height of a global pandemic seemed the perfect opportunity to emigrate countries, but I am delighted to be joining you live here from Toronto this afternoon. So as we mentioned, we're going to be spending the next kind of half an hour or so talking about how you can adopt a platform native approach to your security in the cloud. We're going to leave hopefully a little bit of time for questions at the end, and then we have a series of roundtables that we're going to be breaking out into to talk in a little bit more detail about this. But without any further ado, I shall begin. And of course, we've always got to start with one of these slides. It would be rude not to. You've all seen these stats before. The world that we live in is becoming increasingly dangerous. The bad actors are taking full advantage of the situation that we all find ourselves in right now. And it's something that's, of course, top of mind for all of us on this call, but also, the wider business and the wider organizations that we are all a part of. And the threat is just getting bigger and bigger, of course, as we start to, evolve into this world of, device proliferation everywhere, the amount of data that these devices are creating and the security risks that these devices create become, more and more of a challenge for organizations to address. And so, we encourage organizations to start to think a little bit more strategically about how they deal with this. We're also, of course, entering a world where, security boundaries are starting to diminish. Our approach to security used to be big walls and deep moats and keep all the baddies out. That doesn't necessarily fly quite so well in this world where we're all working from home. We're all working from everywhere, and we now have so many more services which are being exposed out onto the internet. So this kind of dual perfect storm of device proliferation and increased digital service provision is creating these real challenges. And as we said, the bad guys are more than stepping up to this, and we're starting to see far more sophisticated attacks, not just against now our underlying infrastructure, but more importantly around our identity and our applications. This is where the real challenge is today about how do we start to create this modern security environment to protect our employees and protect our customers. What does this ultimately mean? Well, it means that now everyone is in the security business. We used to think about security as a discipline. Security is now increasingly becoming a mindset, and it's something that everyone within our organization needs to buy into. Traditional tools, honestly, have not really kept a pace with this. And again, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time today focusing on this. And security professionals alone cannot fill the gap. This is not something that we can just throw more people at. We need a change of perception and we need a change of approach. Now, as you will probably discover over the next half an hour or so, I am somewhat biased in my opinion on these things. But our message to customers is really, how do you start to create a new partnership with your security vendor? How do you start to work with an organization that can provide a far more holistic set of services to help you combat these challenges that we are facing all around us? And for me, Microsoft is uniquely positioned in that market to be able to both provide the tooling, but also to be able to provide the operational support that sits around that. And one of the great things about working with Microsoft as your security partnership is the access that it gives you to Microsoft as a security organization. Microsoft, of course, is one of only a handful of organizations on the planet that run hyperscale public cloud environments. There are tons and tons of vendors that kind of play around the security space, but Microsoft is uniquely positioned in the fact that it's actually also using all of these tools and capabilities to support its own cloud. And obviously there are only a handful of these hyperscale clouds on the planet. What does that give you? I say it gives you the ability to take advantage of all of the data and all of the telemetry that Microsoft is producing as part of all of these cloud services that they operate at. I'm not going to sort of share all the statistics with you. You can sort of read them from the slide, but over 1 billion accounts within Azure AD. My favorite stat of 6.5 trillion threat signals analyzed daily. I mean, that is just a quite scary amount of data that people are onboarding. And I love getting into these debates with people about public cloud versus private cloud, and how private cloud is so secure because you're trapped away in your little enclave, and nobody comes to attack you. And as you move into this public cloud world, you're effectively now placing this giant target on your back because you're now part of a cloud that everybody is going to be trying to attack. And I always reverse that argument to say, well, actually, being able to spot and respond to security threats is actually inversely proportionate to the amount of data that you're able to analyze. Realistically, as a small private cloud, you're not going to be seeing the amount of telemetry and the amount of data that's actually going to be able to help you identify those threat actors. And Microsoft has, a phenomenally sophisticated platform to help you with this. The amount of investment and the amount of work that Microsoft does out there actively, searching out these threat actors, the zoos, the dark markets, the threat feeds, and all of the telemetry that, as we said, that they're getting from all of their products and services, it's a phenomenal data set that effectively we can all now avail ourselves of as customers of the Microsoft security platform. So we've got this phenomenal amount of data, which then effectively goes into, machine learning models and AI models of, biblical perspectives or biblical scales. And again, the amount of actual analysis that we can do on that is, really quite exciting. What's even more exciting, of course, then, is if you then start to take advantage of these platform native tools, and we're going to be spending a little bit more time talking about those platform native tools, you effectively get the benefit of all of that, central processing that Microsoft is doing to protect its cloud platform, available to now help to protect your users and your customers through a kind of a range of platform native capabilities. So what effectively have we got to try and do here as we move into this new brave cloud world? Well, effectively, it's what we did before. We need to start to construct a model where we can, first of all, protect our employees and our customers. We then need to be able to detect when somebody has managed to get through those barriers. We need to be able to investigate that. And of course, we need to be able to respond to that. So this is ultimately what we need to try and create. Now it's just a question of, and how do we actually practically go about doing that? And how can we, take advantage, in our opinion, of, the Microsoft Cloud as a great platform to help you to be able to do that. And we divide the problem into two halves, effectively. There are two burning challenges that you have as organizations. The first one is, how can we secure our core cloud? How can we secure and protect, the base infrastructure and platforms that our applications and services are running on? And then the second half of the problem then is, how can we then start to secure our workplace? And of course, workplace is now a virtual concept, but how can we make sure that we keep our employees safe as part of their day-to-day jobs? So let's sort of jump straight into this and talk first of all about how we can start to build this new secure workplace. And no surprises here, but the story is very much around zero trust, and you've probably all been to dozens and dozens of talks about zero trust, so I won't bore you to tears too much, but conceptually, zero trust is a mindset, not a technical solution. So that's sort of the first thing that we need to think about. The second thing, and probably most important thing, is that zero trust is built on identity, and we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about identity management because it is just so important in this new cloud world. again, I get into these interesting conversations with customers that say, well, you know, identity is part of end user compute, which is part of something else. And I'll go, no, 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 no. Like, identity is now like a first party citizen. You know, identity is now one of the major things that you need to think about. And then the final part is, you know, a move to zero trust, you know, requires, you know, a complete reimagining of what your, you know, operating model for all of your IT services is, because the old approaches we've taken, you know, the old playbooks don't necessarily work quite as effectively as we move into this zero trust world. And what are the three guiding principles behind zero trust? You know, the first one is assume breach, which again kind of seems counterintuitive. You know, the idea of security is to stop breaches, but you know, we have to, you know, open our eyes to the fact that, you know, there are threat actors, you know, within probably at least one of the systems of all of the participants on this call right now. So, you know, we have to assume that the bad guys have found their way in. So in order to do that, we have to make sure that we apply this kind of least privileged model, you know, assuming that they have got in, how can we stop them being able to do damage? And then finally, you know, this notion of verifying explicitly everything that's going on. You know, assumption is the mother of all mess ups, as they say, and you know, that could not be a more apt point as we talk about security. You know, the fact that we can point to a single signal now, which used to be you know, a tick that, you know, something was good. We can't do that anymore. You know, we have to make sure that we are checking each and everything, because, you know, these threat actors are getting so sophisticated in what they do that we can assume nothing anymore. You know, we have to assume that there is some false data which is, you know, hiding these actors. And what we need to do, what you need to do, is start to think about, you know, how you can create this zero trust roadmap, and how we can start to, you know, introduce these additional checks that we need to do as part of, you know, securing our cloud environment. And again, we haven't got time necessarily to go into all of these, but, you know, focusing on how we can verify identity as, you know, that kind of first port of call, but then how we can then start to think about, you know, devices and verifying those devices, and then into finally, you know, the health of those devices. And, you know, all of these effectively come together as signals that allow us to say, yes, this is, you know, a valid user, or this is an unauthorized user. And it's a multi-dimensional problem. You know, we've got to, as we said, think about identity, endpoints, apps and data, network and infrastructure. And we need to, as much as possible, try and get as far right here as we possibly can. And again, I'm not going to go into huge detail about each one of these boxes. You know, these slides will be available after, and you can sort of read through in your own time. But as you'll see, as we get further and further right, you know, we're getting further and further software defined effectively, and we're getting further and further in terms of this, you know, verifying everything that an organization says, everything that a user says. So, and you might not necessarily be able to get to that optimized model for everything, you know, especially in that apps and data category. You know, it becomes increasingly difficult to get to that optimized space, especially if we're looking at, you know, legacy applications, COTS applications that we don't necessarily have that ability to, you know, inject all of the controls directly into it. And in those circumstances, we will, you know, place a greater bearing on some of the other signals that we're getting. But ideally, you know, the further right that we can get across each one of these four dimensions, you know, the greater the chance you've got of, you know, protecting and detecting those intrusions. So let's just spend a couple of minutes, first of all, talking about identity, because we've said that it's fairly important in this new world. And some more stats, you know, 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft. You know, that statistic never ceases to floor me. You look at the, you know, the vast majority of the things that we observe, you know, it's down to poor passwords. It's down to the use of, you know, non-approved applications, typically with the same password as you're using on your corporate devices. You know, passwords as a concept are starting to, you know, reach the end of their useful life cycle. And we need to start to think about how we can create these new modern identity providers that, yes, sure, still use passwords for the time being, but at least have a roadmap to get you off of them as quickly as possible. Now, again, we're of course highly biased in the advice that we give, but we think that Azure Active Directory, is a great identity provider for you to consider as part of, one of your anchor tenants for your new cloud security model. The nice thing about Azure Active Directory is if you're using Active Directory on premises today, it's a fairly easy lift to connect that into Azure Active Directory. What's also nice though is the ability that it has to federate across multiple different identity providers, both within the business to business space, but also in the business to consumer space. And any of you that are providing services to end customers over the internet, an ability to be able to federate with, Google accounts, Microsoft accounts, and so forth is super exciting. What's also really interesting about Azure AD is the integrations that it's got with, thousands of commercial SaaS applications. So a lot of organizations, would naturally snap to thinking, well, we've got to use Okta or Centrify or something like that because of the range of integrations that they've got. My advice would be at least have a look at what Azure AD has got in terms of those integrations, because I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at just how easy this is to deploy as part of your organization. Where it starts to get even more interesting is when we then start to layer on the security capabilities over the top of Azure AD. So the free version, if you like, of Azure AD is great, and it does a ton of stuff. But where it starts to get more interesting is when we start to look at some of the premium SKUs, and specifically Microsoft Defender for Identity. That's a new name if you're in the Microsoft space. So that was just released a couple of weeks ago. What Microsoft Defender for Identity does is effectively provide those very, very sophisticated analysis over the top of what your users are doing, and this ability again to be able to build up this sort of multi-layered, multidisciplinary approach to protecting those users, and the amount of intelligence that Microsoft can bring to be able to spot, is this a valid user performing an authorized action, or is this a bad actor that is trying to slip through? And this ability to be able to, step up to multi-factor authentication, and this ability to be able to support passwordless-based authentication to all of these different cloud-based systems is really quite exciting. So Azure Active Directory, Microsoft Defender for Identity, sort of your two platform native solutions, I guess, to help protect that first line of defense, which is identity within the public cloud. Moving across then into endpoint, this is sort of, again, if we look at that zero trust, we've identified the identity now. We're now starting to look at, what's the actual device that's trying to access these services. And look, we've all seen the memes, right? Windows Defender, bit of a laughing stock 3 or 4 years ago, probably rightly so. But the reality is that, Microsoft Defender has come on so much, and what the people that make the memes don't tell you is, of course, that Microsoft is now right up there in that top right-hand quadrant for endpoint protection. And yeah, you could argue the toss about CrowdStrike. It's got a couple extra bells and whistles, but the reality is that there is very, very little in it now between Microsoft and a lot of these other endpoint protection products, which who wouldn't have thought that we'd have said that 2 or 3 years ago, but that's where we are today. So please don't write off Microsoft Defender based on what you thought you might have known about it based in the past. Reevaluate those capabilities as part of this new modern approach to platform security. Because again, one of the great things about Defender is that it's platform native. This is built into Windows 10. So if your estate is a largely Microsoft estate, this ability to be able to just switch on this Defender capability is super exciting. But it's not, of course, just Windows 10. There are Defender endpoints available now across a range of different operating systems, across a range of different devices, but that native integration that it gives is super important. It's also quite interesting as we start to look at things like Windows Virtual Desktop, for instance. Any of you who are looking at that, try deploying third-party endpoint security onto a Windows Virtual Desktop environment, will not end particularly well for you. Whereas again, Defender is built into the actual platform itself. We can just switch that on with the flick of a button. What's of course nice though is, again, we can take that endpoint telemetry and we can then start to compose it into these conditional access policies that we are building within Azure Active Directory. So we can then start to actually enforce policies directly onto the devices. But we can then also take those signals and then effectively use them to enrich that risk score as part of Azure Active Directory. So because the endpoint is now running natively on the device, that can now actually report on the health of that device. Have we got all of the latest patches? Have we got all of the latest virus signatures? Is there anything that that user has done to that device that might have compromised it in some way? Using the native capabilities, we're able to get all of that telemetry and then feed that up as part of that login process and so whether that user is going to be authorized or denied access to that resource or stepped up to additional forms of authentication. So I could talk about this for hours, as you can probably tell, but again, hopefully that just gives you sort of a brief overview in terms of some of the capabilities around that secure workplace story from Microsoft. And if any of you are using Microsoft 365 today or have bought Microsoft 365 today, the good news is that you are already licensed for all of this technology. So this is not something that you're having to go out and buy as an additional upgrade. This is something that you've already got access to, which again keeps the CFOs happy. So let's kind of change tack briefly now and talk about the secure cloud. So we've secured our endpoints. We've now got to think about securing the actual applications and services that our employees and customers are using. And there are a number of challenges securing cloud-based platforms. You've only got to read the news to hear about, the latest hack involving Capital One or whoever it might be. And the reality is that, these are phenomenally complicated, environments to secure. But the dangers of not securing them are also, heinous as well. So it's something that we've really got to think about very carefully, how we can start to create this unified approach to security across our entire estate, because the bad guys are getting very, very clever. I mean, they always were clever, but they're getting even more clever in this cloud world, and they're effectively now starting to go through these multi-point multi-vector, multi-stage attacks where, for instance, they might look for, a little chink in the armor, that exposure of something which they can then start to hook into. And taking the Capital One example, that was exactly what they did. They managed to exploit something that was fairly benign, but that kind of got them access to something. In that instance, it was access to the back end of one of the services, which was operating exactly as it was designed to operate. But what the bad guys will then do, which is the scary part, is they will then take that access and then they will start to move laterally within your environment or laterally within your cloud platform in the case of public cloud. And that's then when the danger starts to occur. So, a small exposure, then some, benign access, but then that lateral movement is then what turns this from being, something not scary into suddenly being something really, really very scary. And that then provides them access to things that, they were never supposed to be able to do. Now, fair enough to AWS, they were quite correct. There was nothing actually wrong with the way that the cloud platform was working. It was doing what it was supposed to be doing. There was just, one bad piece of config and a scenario that not necessarily anybody had thought about before. And that then turned into a successful attack. And obviously we all know what happened after that. So what we need to do is how can we start to apply these, governance policies, these guardrails, if you like, that stop that bad configuration getting in there in the first place, and if that bad configuration does get in there, stopping it from actually being acted upon and actually being absorbed into the system. And this is where this notion of policy management becomes really, really important. How can a central IT team effectively start to construct these guardrails, start to construct these controls that mean that the developers and the operations people can still do what they need to do? One of the biggest challenges with all of these security initiatives is that they actually stop people from being able to do their day job. And as soon as you stop people from being able to do their day job, guess what? They'll just find a workaround for it. So, we need this kind of best of both worlds where we have this, agility and ability for people to be able to do their work, but also make sure that they're doing it in a safe and compliant way. And that's how things like Azure Policy can be really quite interesting. So we can now effectively be declarative in terms of, what good looks like. What are the controls that we want to put in place? What are the things we want to be able to stop people from doing? Then effectively rolling out those compliance policies and then being able to report back on, the extent to which that policy is being adhered to. So Azure Policy is kind of the ace up the sleeve in terms of how we can avoid, the kinds of compromises that we're starting to observe. The second kind of part of the whole secure cloud conversation is Azure Defender. So again, this is a new brand released a couple of weeks ago. And effectively what this allows you to do is to provide that kind of same rich security protection that we saw on the endpoint side, but against resources within the public cloud. So, against virtual machines and Kubernetes and app services and databases and networks. And, this list continues to grow and grow by the day. But again, because this is Azure Defender, it's built into Azure, it's the best mechanism, again, in our humble opinion, to protect all of those services that you are deploying into the public cloud. And there are, as I said, more and more services which are coming. Azure Defender gives you these kind of rich dashboards where you can go in, and as you can see all the various different services at the top there, and you can see kind of threats in real time and recommendations that Microsoft is making in terms of how you can go ahead and provide additional security and additional controls over the top of all of those. And then finally, the jewel in the crown, and I felt it actually did justify the curtain transition effect there in PowerPoint, is Azure Sentinel. So Azure Sentinel, SIEM product, cloud native from Microsoft. It's another one of those platforms where you might just go, well, obviously we're going to use Splunk because, Splunk's the only, enterprise grade SIEM out there on the market. And I challenge you and I say, well, actually, Azure Sentinel is definitely something that, we think that you should at least, pay some attention to and, have a look at, because it really is, a fairly incredible piece of engineering that that Microsoft has done to pull all of these various different signals together. And again, the nice thing about Sentinel is that it's being fed by those exact same threat streams that Microsoft is observing across all of the rest of its public cloud. So, SIEMs traditionally can only, again, analyze the data that they have. This ability to be able to onboard all of this data and then be able to surface it up to you that says, this particular customer in this particular geography is under this particular kind of attack at the moment. How can we then translate that into, your environment with your service and, the potential that you might come under that same attack in the coming minutes or hours. So we've got these kind of rich dashboards that we can create. We can then start to see in real time, these threats unfolding. So, this is a real example of, an output from the telemetry that's being collected by a user trying to log on to this and all of the various things that they've been trying to do. And this is where, again, it starts to get quite interesting. And, I hate talking about AI and ML because, frankly, when you go onto the websites of some of these security vendors, it's almost every third word is AI or ML. And I'm always a bit kind of cautious about talking about it. But the reality is, there is some really quite phenomenal work going on behind the scenes to be able to spot these, these threats, this, this needle in the haystack that we're going after. And, just to give, a trivially simple example, and, this is preschool stuff, but, you'll kind of get the idea, a situation where perhaps, we've got a workstation that somebody is using that's got, Azure Defender for, Defender for Endpoint installed onto it. That information is then being sent to Microsoft. Somebody is accessing Tor, which in itself is not necessarily something that you might want to sound the alarm bells about. But then what we can also do is we can then start to take feeds from other things as well, like a Palo Alto firewall that just happened at the same time to, spot that same IP address. But this time, coming back the other way onto that workstation. Again, there's a virus within there. It's not good. We're going to block it, but we're not going to necessarily sound the alarms that something, quite tragic is about to happen. But the two of those things happening together at the same time is actually something that, is that trigger that something actually might be happening that's a little bit worse than we might think. So this Azure Sentinel Fusion technology that allows you to take all of this data and be able to do this in real time is, really quite exciting. And again, just to demonstrate the scale of this, 6.7 trillion signals per day are going through this kind of pattern matching and this aggregation and this joining together. So it's all kind of quite impressive. But the great thing is you've now got access to be able to consume that as a service. I don't have to set up servers and log agents and this, that, and the other anymore. I can effectively just install and run this. And if I'm using Azure Defender, that literally is a next finish. And, I'm now taking all of this telemetry data from all of my environments, sending that straight into Sentinel. But I can, of course, also take threat feeds from elsewhere. So, partner solutions like the Palo Alto thing that we were talking about, network data, and, also multiple clouds as well. We can take all of that data as well, and we can also send it to other places. So, if you do want to use third-party SIEM products, again, we can still create this integrated model. So, pause for breath there for a second. I'm sure you're all probably sitting there thinking, well, that's all very interesting, Dan, but, we're not a Microsoft shop. We have other clouds. We use AWS, we use GCP. This platform native thing from Microsoft is all very interesting, but doesn't really apply to us. And to that, I would challenge you, and I would say, well, actually, again, what's kind of interesting here is, Microsoft's been the underdog, right? Amazon's ruled the roost for many years. So Microsoft's had to approach this from quite a different mindset, which isn't that, by default, people are going to be using our things. Therefore, by default, our platforms and solutions only need to work for our cloud, which ironically is the approach that Amazon is taking. So, they've had this underdog mentality, and that has now effectively applied itself to something called Azure Arc. So Azure Arc, again, is a reasonably new member of the Microsoft family, but it provides everything that we've effectively spoken about in terms of policy management and security and threat protection, and now allows you to apply that into this kind of hybrid world where we now have multiple clouds. We've got on-premises environments, we've got edge environments. Not even begun to speak about that today, but that's again the next great area that we all need to think about. How can we start to protect the edge? And this ability with Arc to be able to project these Microsoft services into this hybrid multi-cloud environment, again, is really quite interesting and exciting. And there's work to be done, of course. It doesn't support every single service on every single cloud, but Microsoft's going all guns blazing right now to try and expand the remit of this of these technologies and make sure that they can work in as many different venues as possible. So, with that, to close, ultimately, this is a big strategic decision that you need to make, right? What is your approach to all of this? When we talk about things like, cloud first, cloud native, what is it that we actually mean? And, the reality is, unfortunately, as we work with a lot of organizations, for them, cloud native means best of breed. It means, the Christmas tree approach to security and IT service management. And sure, that might be right for some organizations. But, we really, truly, passionately believe that platform native is, in fact, the best form of cloud native. And if you can take advantage of these SaaS and PaaS offerings that are available natively within the cloud, we think that is your quickest path to value. And, the closer and more integrated these solutions are, the less chance of stuff falling between the cracks. And so, in closing, we believe that simplicity is in fact the ultimate sophistication. So we'll be delighted to get into more detail with you about this. We've got a few minutes now for questions and answers. We also have a breakout roundtable session after this, and I'm delighted to have a few of my colleagues join me that actually know about this stuff, so you can drill them in more detail. But my colleagues Esteban and Matt and Daryl will be joining me for those roundtable discussions. So with that, Jason, it's back to you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. Very thorough and a lot of information to take in there, folks. And we do have some questions here. So to Dan's point, following this session, we are going to have a roundtable, which basically is a nice continuation of what we just discussed, which is going to focus on why security is fundamentally different in the cloud. But before we get to that, we do have some questions from the audience here I do want to cover off. And the first one is actually, I'm going to ask, is a bit of a continuation to what you were just closing with there. So you mentioned things like best of breed, for example. Louis Eric Renaud asks, is it better to centralize security under the same Microsoft umbrella instead of having several different systems?
I'm clearly biased, of course, in the answer that I would give, but I would say yes, that's a brilliant idea. But no, in all seriousness, I mean, that's the great decision that people need to make. You know, is a best of breed approach the right one, or is a best of platform approach the right one? And, you know, we can get into debates about, well, this particular vendor has this particular feature that isn't available in the platform. And, you know, you can do that for hours. But, you know, the reality is from what we see is, you know, actually that last 5–10% that's, you know, the difference between the best of breed and the built-in solution within the platform, the majority of people don't even use those features. And, you know, again, one of the other big challenges, a lot of these best of breed solutions, they all overlap with each other. You know, it's not like a clean, well, we're going to use this for this and this for this. You know, they all want to do as much as they possibly can, so they're all going to fight with each other. And so there is no clean handoff between a lot of these third-party solutions, which I think is where a lot of people get tripped up.
That's a great point. Best of breed, great, until they all start acquiring one another anyway, and it comes under one umbrella. So, fantastic. Claude Sanfo asks, what do you see as the next cloud initiative for that Microsoft has in mind?
That is a good question. I mean, I think it's fair to say security is a huge bet in general for them right now. You know, Microsoft's always been famous for, you know, taking all of these third-party things and building them natively into the platform, and I think they're going to continue to do that. You know, there've been tons of, as I said, announcements a couple of weeks ago around all of the rebranding of all of the Microsoft security suites. So I think they're going to continue to invest in that and providing that, you know, much richer capability across different clouds, across different services. I think we can see big investment from there. Sentinel is their huge bet. You know, there's no doubt about that. You know, the amount of engineering work that's going into that is quite phenomenal. You know, more generally within Microsoft, outside of the security arena, you know, Dynamics is a huge push for them right now. You know, how they can start to bring that kind of business applications into native cloud services and, you know, give SAP and NetSuite and Oracle a run for their money. But, you know, there's just so much. It's hard. It's difficult to keep up with everything that Microsoft's doing quite now. It's quite an exciting space to be in.
Definitely. Charles Bureau asks, what's your recommendation for Active Directory users account maintenance / cleanup, as it's always challenging to keep the AD clean with real active users versus deactivated accounts? Seems to miss a real sync with human resources or a tool from Microsoft. So again, what's your recommendation for Active Directory users account maintenance?
So JML, yeah, joiners, movers, leavers is super important. And again, as we help organizations move into the cloud, you know, it's about starting to automate a lot of those processes that, you know, used to be manual before. You know, orphan accounts, you know, one of the biggest security risks out there. So, you know, there's you know, out of the box connectors with things like, you know, Workday, for instance. So, you know, as you're onboarding people into your HR systems, that ability to be able to automatically, you know, provision within Azure AD is there. There's things like, you know, Microsoft Identity Manager, you know, still kicking about that can help in terms of that. And there are third-party solutions that sit over the top of Azure AD. And I think, you know, they're perfectly valid. You know, any solution that enriches a native capability within the cloud, I think is great. You know, my challenge is always third-party solutions that want to replace or replicate a feature which is available natively in the cloud. That's where the challenge comes. But yeah, there's tons of these products that sit around Azure AD to help with that kind of stuff.
Awesome, thank you very much. That brings us to the close of the first session, an extremely informative session and an extremely relevant topic. So thank you very much, Dan. A virtual round of applause for Dan for delivering that for us.
Thank you.
No worries.